So in this video, we're going to explore where semantic technology is as an ecosystem, as Mike mentioned in a previous video. So we're going to look at exactly what exists and what doesn't, what's working, and where there's some gaps. So in general, the standards and practices are maturing. Some of these standards are actually well over 10 years old. They're very well understood. They've been through a full cycle of updates and recommendations and then new recommendations and working groups putting them together. And so those things are very solid. The triple and the RDF standard are very solid. RDFS is in good shape. OWL, there have been some updates to that. So again, fairly well understood and continuing to grow, especially as enterprises start to want to make more and more use of this. Those standards will become more defined to add features that are useful in an enterprise context. The ecosystem itself is expanding, and so by ecosystem, as Mike mentioned in the previous video, we're talking about what kind of tools exist, what vendors exist, what are your options if you want to learn how to use this technology and use this technology. What's nice about the ecosystem is we see both small niche players, companies that are focused maybe on a triple store, a pure play triple store who have never released a piece of software before, and that's where they're putting their engineering effort and they're doing really creative things. You've got big players like Oracle, who have embedded graph databases, so triple stores essentially within their existing products and integrated it with their relational database in this case, so you can actually run SQL queries that query the graph database and Sparkle queries that query the relational database. So we see the big players there in terms of the storage. We also see more and more players in the training and use space, so companies that are working to educate around semantics, companies that have the ability to work with teams to integrate semantic technology into their existing platforms. Seeing a lot more options there now as people start to understand how to use this technology. We're also seeing a set of offerings, for instance, tools that sit on top of existing relational data stores to create Sparkle endpoints, to actually make them look like triple stores and work like triple stores. So we're seeing that start to come into play as well. And then finally, we're seeing real world usage. So whereas years ago, most of this stuff was academic in nature, and there was a lot of theory involved, and people were trying techniques out, but it wasn't really being applied in a broad enterprise context. We're actually now seeing enterprises using it, enterprises investing in the technology, enterprises integrating it to solve problems that were just really difficult for them to solve using more traditional methods, whether we're talking about relational database integrations or data warehousing to bring data together. We're now seeing this technology being put to those types of use. So it's great to see that grow. I actually like to compare the way semantics is coming along to the way relational databases grew, because fundamentally what we're talking about is a paradigm shift in how we represent our stored assets, our stored data. And the same type of shift occurred with relational databases. Back in 1967, Edgar Codd published a paper that explained a much better way to store data than the flat file systems, the VSAM systems that were in use at the time. And it made a lot of sense that you would want to represent your data in this new way. And by 1970, he formalizes that in a way that is now clear how to implement this, but it takes almost 10 years before we see Oracle release a reasonably useful relational database product. So that's the first one really out there that you can start to make a lot of use of. That gets IBM's attention. IBM's the big player at that time with computers and hardware and mainframes, flat files, and they say, okay, we're going to create our own, we're going to call it DB2. That doesn't actually come out until the mid-1980s. And then we immediately see things like Sybase, and then eventually we see Microsoft SQL Server. But it takes a while for that ecosystem to actually form. And then if you look at this chart, the red line is companies actually investing in the technology. That teal-colored line is how long it took to actually adopt it. So it was relatively easy for companies to procure a relational database by the mid-1980s. But now, a staff of developers who were used to reading and writing VSAM files and those data structures that they use to relate information, all of a sudden had to learn things about SQL and a whole different way to relate data in tables and foreign keys and all these concepts. And that created a gap, a good 5-year gap, before they could figure that out. And so overall, it was a good 15 years before we went from an understanding of this is a great way to store data to people actually making effective use of that great way to store data. And I think we're seeing the same thing here. These concepts around semantic data are very different than the relational data constructs that we're very used to. And so we're used to drawing entity relationship diagrams and those types of things and thinking in those terms. And suddenly the paradigm is unrelated. And so it's going to take a while before people get their head around, how do I use this? What does it mean? Get the technology in-house and understand the dynamics of it. Where does it perform well, et cetera? How do I tune it? All those kinds of things that we take for granted on the relational side. So I think it's a very similar journey we're seeing. Another thing that we're seeing forming and happening with semantics is that because it does allow us to take a lot of disparate data and combine it and rationalize it essentially into a common context, that ontology, and because I can have different ontologies for different purposes that are looking at the same data, it is a very powerful way to try out analytical techniques. So if I'm trying to understand my data and build analytic models, I now have a way that I can adjust my data and the relationships in the data and even the data I'm federating or pulling together in a much more agile fashion than having to worry about restructuring a set of relational tables and things like that. So I can try things much more quickly, my cycles are shorter, and pulling data together from an analytic point of view, that's very powerful and gives me a bunch of new options. Finally, I wanted to just mention some of the real-world use that we're seeing. And you can find a lot of these yourself on the internet, but certainly the BBC was one of the early adopters of this technology in a big way. They realized that it would allow them to take what is a very disparate data set or collection of data sets and be able to pull them together to do reporting, generate web pages, etc. And they made a lot of use of that with World Cup coverage and Olympics coverage. And what was great about the BBC is that their developers actually published blogs and a lot of information, even their ontologies, to publicize how they did this. And it's a great way to start to learn about how does this stuff work and what does it look like and what's the process and some of the angst that the team went through, some of the trials and tribulations, if you like. And so it's a really great case study, and they were very open about it. So if you go look at BBC's site and search for the semantic information, they've got a treasure store of insights around how they used it. If you go to things like data.gov or data.gov UK, the government sites, they're actually using semantic technology to release a lot of information to the public. They want to create this open government, allow people to create on top of this data that citizens have paid for to have collected. And they know that semantics is a very straightforward way to be able to publish it and modify ontologies as new data comes along. So they're making a lot of use of it. And then there's some other examples mentioned on the slide of companies who are making use of this. And again, you can do Google searches and find lots of examples of these. And we will, in one of our future videos, actually walk through a case study of exactly how we use semantic technology.